everybody. Great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Angele Latham. I've been working as a journalist for much of the last decade in various roles, both in print, now working in broadcast, and the First Amendment is so core to obviously what we are able to do as journalists. So Angele Latham is the First Amendment reporter at the Tennessean and is serving as the first ever reporter for such a beat, thanks to a partnership between the paper, the Freedom Forum, and the journalism funding partners. She's covered a wide range of topics, from book bans to protests, public records, church-state overlap, LGBTQ issues, and far more. Anything that touches your First Amendment rights, she's on it. Hailing from Hickman, Tennessee, Angele attended Middle Tennessee State University and worked at multiple papers across the state before joining the Tennessean. And give Angele a round of applause. Welcome her to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I was so excited to see Stanislav on the roster of wonderful speakers here today. He actually stayed in our newsroom for a little bit, I think late last year, and it was a fascinating conversation with him because I told him I was the First Amendment reporter, and he just looked at me and he was like, why are there issues with the First Amendment? Like, that's such a great thing, you have that. Like, why are there problems? And I was like, that is a great question, bud. Don't know. So, as Taylor said, my name is Angele Latham. I'm the First Amendment reporter at the Tennessean in Nashville, Tennessee. We're the largest paper in the state, and we decided to embark on this beat celebrating the First Amendment. This was a partnership between the journalism funding partners and the Freedom Forum. The Freedom Forum is a large nonpartisan group based in Washington, D.C. that helps promote First Amendment literacy for people. And they decided that we needed this beat because they do a survey every year that discusses the understanding of the First Amendment just throughout the country. And for unknown reasons, Hawaii and Tennessee ranked the absolute abysmally lowest for understanding the First Amendment. I do not yet know. I will get back to you if I figure out why. But they came to the Tennessean and they're like, we need to get someone on this. There's clearly a distinct lack of First Amendment understanding for an issue that is clearly very important to everyone in this room and everyone in this country. And at the time, I was serving as the government accountability reporter in Jackson, Tennessee, and they tell me that they asked me in because they're like, oh, you were just in the right place in your career. It's secretly because this job deploys a lot of being talkative, and I'm very talkative. One of my editors actually said, yeah, you have a really big personality. And I was like, all right, I'll take that as a compliment. So we started this beat, and it's been going very well. It could not have come at a better time. Over the past year and a half, Tennessee has exploded in First Amendment issues, as has the rest of the country. Let me be clear, this is not discounting the hundreds of First Amendment issues that I have yet to touch because I can only handle one state at a time. But over just the past 3 weeks alone, actually, I have been involved in a story that has probably dominated most of y'all's headlines, the campus protests that have really exploded over multiple private universities across the U.S. Vanderbilt University, based in Nashville, was actually the first university to kind of kick off those protests, and their encampment has been going on for 36 days straight now. And I actually was there right before I flew out here, trying to get an update on that. There were 4 students arrested in the beginning of these protests in late March, including a reporter mere seconds after I scooted across to the other side of the scene. So it was a pretty intense moment there. But this kind of underscores a lot of what Dr. Davis was speaking of, that this job goes from incredibly routine to incredibly dangerous very quickly. It is a very interesting job, and I'm very excited to be doing it. But the First Amendment, as we're all here to understand, is a very polarizing topic. There's a reason that's the headline. Every single issue I have covered in the past year and a half just building this beat has been incredibly eye-opening to the deeply pitched ideals that people have in the First Amendment. The First Amendment is an inherently emotional topic. The whole point is the freedom of speech. No one comes to First Amendment conflicts or debates going, I feel kind of on this. Everyone is there because they have a deeply held belief and a deeply held passion for the thing that they are supporting. We have hit so many issues in Tennessee just in the short time that we've been building this, the campus protest being a current one. There's book bans. There's a huge issue going on in states across the country, particularly in a number of red states. Something PEN America, which is a literacy freedom advocacy group, has labeled a catastrophic increase in book removals and book bans across the state. We have had massive numbers of that in Tennessee, and it's becoming a very intense, every single year it pops back up as soon as the school year starts, and we have books just being removed across shelves. I'm working on a story currently that's not out about a really interesting debate on a new abortion law that passed in Tennessee that restricts the right for minors to leave the state for abortion care. There's a very concerning First Amendment aspect to that where the word recruit is used in the bill, which is not defined in state law. And this has become an issue in Idaho as well, where this law was already passed, because people do not know what the word recruit means. It's not defined in state law, and now a number of doctors' offices don't know if they're allowed to speak to people who seek health care. They don't know what that means because it has felony charges attached to it. So that's a current issue we're working on. Oh my God, there's just so many. Most notably, I think, and one that my friend Jeremy with this lovely organization was very excited for me to speak on, has been the fight for protest rights across the state since last year. I'm sure many of you have probably heard about they've been named the Tennessee Three. It was 3 lawmakers who they decided to protest on the House floor following the tragic Covenant shooting in Nashville, Tennessee. I was on the ground for all of this. We very quickly hustled to cover the shooting. We actually got the text early that Monday morning and were arriving on the scene as the shooter was killed. We were among the very first responders on the scene, and that event triggered just a windfall of protests greater than the state has ever seen before. Shortly after that, 3 lawmakers of the House of Representatives protested on the House floor promoting better gun safety, and 2 of them, 2 black lawmakers, were expulsed from the House while a third, a white lawmaker, was not. This triggered even more protests, and we have had rolling protests at a rate greater than ever seen in the state of Tennessee, continuing on, and bringing the issue of free speech, of protest rights, and gun safety to the national headlines at this point. I've not yet met a person who did not know about this issue. These rolling protests have actually created a number of First Amendment lawsuits. That there was one where a protester was dragged out of a subcommittee because she held an 8x11 sign on her lap, and suddenly that was illegal. It was not. And she was dragged out of the subcommittee hearing. And that triggered a lawsuit that is now working its way through the courts. They put an emergency stop on the House legislator from banning people holding signs. And so there's currently some litigation going on there. A new lawsuit was put in place after there were too many protesters, and the Speaker of the House did not like that the protesters were booing. And so he decided to restrict the number of people allowed to see the House proceedings. He instilled a ticketing policy without informing anyone of this ticketing policy or allowing tickets to happen. And suddenly, no protesters could be there because they didn't have these mystical tickets that didn't exist. So all of these protests continue rolling and making these very intense First Amendment debates that you really can't catch a break from. The legislative session this year just ended last week, and I'm still dealing with the downfall of all of that legislation. There's too much to cover. But I mention all these issues that I've cherry-picked out of the 8 million First Amendment issues that I've had to cover in the past year and a half, because all of these are incredibly polarized. Again, as is the headline. All of these issues, there's no one apathetic to these things. Every single aspect, people are deeply pitched on their side of the issue. The drag debate that actually started last year, I was the first reporter to cover that. This was a law that Tennessee tried to put in place that would limit where drag performers were allowed to perform. This law was heavily First Amendment debated because you can't just restrict people's expressive rights for particularly for an art form. This law was passed and then quickly overturned by a federal judge who very quickly restricted it and said this is clearly unconstitutionally vague, and a restriction heavily on First Amendment expressive rights. And they actually used our reporting in the opinion for it, showing how deeply entrenched this was in biased violation of the First Amendment. This is currently also being appealed in the state of Tennessee, and the Attorney General is trying to also apply it to private residences. So that's a whole other story that I'm still working on. But these issues, no one is kind of like, I sort of feel okay about this. Every single time we report on this, it becomes deeply heated. I had a very confrontational interview with a lawyer last week about the abortion bill where I'm not sure what profanity I'm allowed to use on this stage, but let's say my editor had to take a very heavy pen to this interview. And there's a lot of red markings across it. That's also why it's not been published yet. But these issues, I think that's kind of embodies why the First Amendment is so important to report on. When you come to these interviews and you try to report on these issues, you're never going to meet someone who is looking at you and going, oh yeah, I guess I could talk about that. Everyone is very passionate and very excited to talk about it. And that's a great thing as a First Amendment reporter, because whenever you're covering other things, it is sometimes a fight to get people to talk to you, which is wild considering how many mean emails we get. You'd think people would want to talk to us. But no, there's a lot of people who really are very excited about a First Amendment reporter. I've had a lot of people come to me and say, oh, this is a really important issue to me, but we've never had someone specifically that we could go to just to discuss free speech rights. That's a huge issue. Everyone cares about their ability to speak, but not everyone is willing to talk to us on the norm. And so having this job has really allowed people to come up to me and say, I feel very strongly about this, and I don't like that this, whatever law I'm discussing at the point, exists. However, people can get very mean about it, which is fine. That's our job. There's nothing you're going to say to me that's going to hurt my feelings. We've heard it all before. If you're a journalist for 2 months, you have heard it all. It's fine. Threaten me, be mean, whatever you want to do. I'm still going to keep doing my job. But these issues are why we have to have these conversations. For the book bans issue, there was people on one side who are very concerned about the restriction of information to communities who need it most, and then people on the other side who believe that information should be restricted based on age, and that school boards and governments have the right to decide what that is. On the drag debate, there's the LGBTQ plus community on one side who are saying, hey, my expressive rights to this cultural art form shouldn't be limited because the legislator decided this was an obscene adult entertainment. Whereas on the other side, there were people who were saying that this type of entertainment wasn't appropriate for public venues. Every single person on these sides are deeply entrenched in their beliefs, which is good. That's the First Amendment. These conversations need to happen because protests don't just explode. You know, you don't just suddenly have people go, you know what, I'm going to protest today. There are conversations that happen before that. There's communities that are not heard that happen before these events occur. These laws do not appear out of nowhere. When I was covering the drag debate, I had so many people coming to me and going, this is such an extreme law. How did this happen? I'm like, well, that's because Tennessee voter turnout is absolutely abysmal. We're one of the last in the country for voter turnout. The number of people who voted for the legislator who crafted this bill was 0.000006% of the state. And this was a law that passed and is still working its way through the court system. Every time we have these intense First Amendment debates, it's because there are conversations that happen beforehand that were not heard. And it's because these conversations are deeply hard to have. No one likes talking to someone who is virulently against their moral political views. It is hard. People don't like confrontation. Dr. Davis did mention, she was like, oh, I do. I understand. It's a journalism trait. I'm like, okay, let's go, you guys. But most people, understandably, you don't want to have a long, lockdown, drag-out argument with someone about why you believe your position's correct. And again, your free speech rights are what give you that right to have that conversation. That's deeply important. But as journalists, we have to remember that we need to have those conversations and dig into those points. It's really the underlying thing, the soft diplomacy. That's so important. When I come at these stories, I cannot come at them going, oh, this person said this person said this. You need to speak to every person on each side of this debate, and you actually have to get to know these people. When I was covering the drag debate, there was a really interesting series of interviews I did where I spoke with the pastors of Madison County, Tennessee, where this law originated. It was literally my backyard. It's where I lived before I moved to Nashville. And the debate started because there was a pastor who did not want drag performances happening at the local theater that was within eyesight of the church. That's how this started. And so when I started this reported, that turned into national headlines. I had to sit down and talk with these pastors because it's a deeply religious community. And these pastors were clearly very, very anti-drag, and they're allowed to be. That's the First Amendment. You can do that. But when you come at these conversations, you also have to explain to people, I say this until I'm blue in the face, precedent matters. You cannot set laws because you don't like a certain type of speech, because that is going to come back and affect you as well. If you have to appeal to people's selfishness, do it. First Amendment is for everyone. There is no world in which you should support a law or support an ideal that restricts someone else's speech just because you don't like it. Journalism is neutral and unbiased at its core and at its best. And that is the point. I must stand here and I have to present this debate of these topics. It doesn't matter how polarized it is. It doesn't matter if you don't like the speakers on the other end of the microphone. If you start restricting someone else's right to speak because you don't find the performances appropriate, because you don't think abortion health care is needed, because you don't think books are suited for certain ages, that will flip on you. I had to have a conversation with someone who was very pro-book ban. They were like, no, these books, I think they're inappropriate. I don't like these topics. And I was like, okay, do you realize a bunch of these topics are also discussed in the Christian Bible? The standards you're putting here are going to restrict the things you're supporting. That's the problem. We have to speak to people on an even plate and say these issues are your issues too. The First Amendment has to be above partisan politics. Every single person, your life is shaped by the First Amendment. You are here because you can speak. You are in this room because I'm allowed to speak to you. That's what this is about. We have to be above partisan conversations. When we want to make this world better, and if you want to support having accurate and fair information and letting journalists actually give you information on what's happening in this world, you have to believe above all that people being allowed to express themselves is above politics. It is the foundation of this country, and it is the foundation of why this industry even exists. We can only be here and talk to each other. America's culture only exists because we have the right to express it. And that was a deep conversation I had with Stan over there, was that he was just asking me after, he was like, well, why are you debating the First Amendment? And he's like this is amazing that you have this. And I was like, I know, but it's, like case precedent. And I was trying to explain it from a very legal point of view, because the trappings of law, 200 plus years of it, there's a lot to go through. But he was like, no, you don't understand. This is such a rich community here. This is he was describing it like it was a tapestry. He's like, it is amazing that you all get to sit here and express these things. He's like, look at this newsroom that we're in. You're allowed to just sit here and debate these things. This is, why do people disagree on this? And I was like, it's true. We sit here and we disagree because we are so deeply entrenched in the ideals that we support, and that's good. But we have to remember above all that the First Amendment, when you're reporting on it, when you're supporting it, when you're living it, is more important than the partisan ideals that you're espousing. It is so important that we make sure that when we stand here and say, I'm speaking on this topic, that you remember that the reason you can speak is because we believe in everyone's ability to speak. That is why we exist. That's the beautiful society we have, is because of that. There is no world where we get to enjoy this if we do not support people's right to speak. And so that's why we sit here and report on this, and that's why we come out here as little bias as possible. There's no way to ever escape total bias. That is simply being a human being. Personally, I just like being right. I hate being wrong. But that is very helpful as a journalist, because I'm never going to report on something biased because I don't want to be wrong. I want to be right. And so if I can't do that from an unbiased point of view, then I need to sit down and redo my argument before I speak. It's the same thing for law. It's the same thing for reporting. It's the same thing for accurately representing the community that you live in. You need to listen to people. You need to speak to people. You need to understand that the only reason people are at that table with you for this First Amendment debate is because they passionately believe in something. And that's beautiful. It doesn't matter what it is, because they are able to sit there and they're able to speak, and you are able to debate them. We will only get better as a country, as a society, if we speak to people and understand them and lift each other up and actually have these conversations no matter how hard they are. And I thank you for listening.
All right. Thanks so much, Angel, for sharing. I can tell you have a lot of passion about this issue. One thing you mentioned as you were talking, I wondered if you'd go in a little bit more depth on, is you mentioned this idea of using journalism as a form of soft diplomacy. Can you define that for us? What does that mean to you?
Absolutely. So sometimes it's very literal in that some people get very angry when you say, hi, I'm a reporter. You don't have to go any further than that. That's enough. So sometimes you really do just have to, in a very literal sense, you have to be very soft in your conversational approach. I mentioned a very contentious interview with a lawyer that happened last week, and if you look at the transcript, it is him yelling and me saying, okay, more yelling, okay, more yelling. That happens, but in a more philosophical sense, it's not even just in your actual approach to conversations. It really is remembering that the whole reason we're doing this job is because I'm talking to you. I do want to hear you. And one of the legislators I spoke to about the drag ban, he was very impassioned in his belief that drag was something that should not be allowed in any setting. He was like, well, this is just, my first step on legislating it. I think this is highly inappropriate. We should not even be having this conversation. And I spoke with him, and sometimes people really expect a confrontation, and sometimes I'll come at you hard. Like sometimes they're not going to be softball questions. I'll come at you. If you're not coming at me with a good argument, you're going to know it. But sometimes I really am just there to listen to you and understand, okay, why are you here at this table for this debate? Because again, protests don't come out of nowhere. Laws don't come out of nowhere. There are steps that lead up to the point that we're at. And so sometimes you really have to be very gentle when you speak with people, because regardless of whether I agree with you, regardless of whether we'll ever see eye to eye, I need to understand you so I can understand the information and the moment in history that we're in. If I sit here and just make assumptions about why you're here, what you stand for, what is even occurring, we are the first draft of history. I cannot sit here and simply write history incorrectly and not represent what's happening simply because so full of pride. I'm like, well, I understand this. Can you imagine misrepresenting history because of your own pride? That's ridiculous. If I had not reported on this correctly, just again using the drag ban as an example, my reporting was used in the court case that found it unconstitutional. If you don't report on things correctly, you actually do impact law and you impact society. You have to come at things softly and understand that everyone is here because they deeply believe in something, and that is a beautiful thing, regardless of what we're discussing.
We live in a time where people are so divided, as you mentioned. Some of the stuff that you've had to cover is among the most divisive topics that we face as a nation today, and a lot of people are in their respective bubbles. They're maybe not talking to people who disagree with them, not hearing those arguments. How do you think of your role as a journalist in kind of bringing those two sides together, and maybe the only forum that somebody will see the perspective from somebody who disagrees with them?
Yeah, sometimes I accidentally write things entirely too long. So my poor editor's like, Angel, we cannot publish 3,000 words on this. I'm like, but they're good words. But it is something you have to remember when you're writing these kinds of things, is that it sounds silly. People will read it, obviously. That's the whole point. But sometimes I'll go to Google something because I'm like, oh, I need the answer on this. And I realize I'm the person who's supposed to be putting it in Google. I'm the person who's writing the thing that I'm looking up, and I'm like, oh, yeah. But then I'm like, well, now I have to go do more research. But you really have to take that, I say burden, it's not a bad thing, but you have to remember that there are a lot of people who are deeply divided on these topics, and you are the one who is presenting both sides of the information. Sometimes that means you have to interview 8 million people and only 3 make it to the story, because you have to make sure it's balanced on both sides. Sometimes that means you have to be very careful about who you interview, because I only have a limited amount of time to hand you this information. It's a very short amount of time. People's attention span on print is literally like 90 seconds max if you don't really hook them in. If I see a 2-minute reading stat on a story, I'm like, yes, I gotta, like you've really gotta rope people in. But that means you have to be very careful. Those first 3 sentences of the story, I need to lay out exactly why this is a problem, why you need to care about it, and also I have really cool people you need to read about. It's a very delicate art, and you have to be very careful about making sure when you present these things that you come across as neutral as possible, because sometimes these conversations that are so polarized and so deeply held in people's hearts, they're not gonna like you when they read it. I don't expect you to like me. You're gonna send me a bunch of hate mail, or sometimes really nice emails. I do save all of my nice emails. They're very sweet. But you have to realize that you are the person handing people the information. They already have a strong opinion on it. So you need to very carefully lay out, hey, here's a problem. This is why it affects you. Because again, the First Amendment is important to all of us and affects all of us. And sometimes people don't realize that because they're like, oh, I'm not a drag queen. I don't care about drag. Oh, I'm not a woman. I don't particularly care about abortion. I'm not getting an abortion. But you have to realize why these issues actually impact you. And so you really have to, it's kind of like real estate for journalism. You've got to use that small space really well.
Obviously, the First Amendment protects our right to express an opinion, to say something that we believe. That doesn't mean that everybody's opinion is true or is reflective of the actual reality in which we live. How do you balance kind of reflecting those diverse perspectives of people while also trying to reflect the true reality in which we live and say, this is someone's opinion, but this isn't rooted in fact? How do you navigate that as a reporter?
Isn't that the golden question for journalism? It can be very difficult because, again, First Amendment, free speech, it is inherently a very impassioned and emotional topic. It always is. There is no way to escape that. You have to, there's kind of a formula I do in most of my stories, which I hope is not too obvious because I don't want everyone to get bored, but it is the best way to present it, is that I'll usually interview, like at the campus protests, I'll interview a student on one side of the debate, I'll interview a student on another, I'll make sure I have some university administration to make sure I get like the rules background, and then I'll make sure I have like a First Amendment expert or a lawyer or many lawyers. And you have to make sure that you express the people on the ground, because again, this is about speech, this is about the people. That is the most important part of this story. You can have 8 million lawyers lined up on a topic, but if they're not on the ground, then I am not reflecting the First Amendment. The whole point is the people. And so you need to speak to the people first. You need to speak to why they're there, why this matters to them, because again, it doesn't just pop out of nowhere. Like, people have beliefs, they're there for a reason. And then you step back and you go, okay, what are the laws that apply to this topic? Also, what are maybe the flaws that have applied to this debate that we're in? And I have a long list of lawyers who routinely get calls from me. The list is growing, so if any of you leave a business card out, you better watch out. But there's a number of them who are like, oh my God, Angel's calling me again. But it's important because I need to make sure that I have an expert on these legal issues, because you need to have the people that are in it, and then you need to have the people removed from it, because the reader is probably not also sitting on the ground during this protest, during these debates, on the House floor going, oh yeah, this is what Angele at the Tennessean says. So you need to give them the flavor of what's going on the ground, which often involves me being in very dirty boots and cargo pants full of pens and notebooks and pens, and I'm darting around between police officers or getting elbowed in the head by protesters or this or that. And then I need to step back and give you the removed view from the legal experts so that you can go, oh, this is how I connect to a story, because you're not there. I need to show you what it looks like, and then I need to explain to you the laws that apply to you and the protesters so you can understand, oh, this is why this matters to me. And so you really have to handle the opinions of the people on the ground versus the experts. And you have to give it equal weight. I would never just decry someone and go, haha, this is an opinion. Now here's what the experts say. Don't do that. But you also have to make sure that you do have to fact check. There are times where I'll have a very strong quote and the next sentence is me fact checking it. You know, the First Amendment is about speech, but I also can't just publish falsehoods. So you have to balance that very carefully and make sure you don't sound like you're like targeting people. I will also let people hang themselves with their own words though. If you give me a real bad quote and you are very passionate about it, I will put that in there and then I will fact check you. That will happen. And sometimes with their silence, there's a lot of people who you request a comment or they're the only people who can comment on an issue and they don't want to talk to you. And I will put in there that you did not want to talk to me. Because if you are causing a problem and then you don't want to talk, I'm going to make sure people know that. Because you need to be held accountable for the things you do to people. So it's very much balancing and presenting truth, but without demonizing people for their feelings on very virulent issues. And it's a very delicate balance.
Looks like we have a question in the audience. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just Angel, this has been very good and very thought-provoking, but let's delve into the difficult side of this. When is free speech too far? When do you go too far? What are the responsibilities of the speaker and the repercussions of free speech? Now we've been talking that it's wonderful, it is precious, but when you speak freely and you express yourself, I now know what you think, and I may not vote for you, I may not buy your product. There are repercussions. You can speak, but it doesn't mean you speak without any responsibility. But talk about it how you view it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that you're right. Like free speech, very important, very inspiring. You also have to know that it's kind of the same thing where laws that restrict free speech can go either way. You expressing your free speech can go either way. If you're going to put your opinion out there, you're putting your opinion out there. If you're making a statement, my God, it has been recorded by my phone and it has been transcribed into my notebook very quickly and in very bad handwriting. So you have to, like for legislators, if you're going to give me a quote and then dance around later and go, oh, wait, that was supposed to be off the record. No, it wasn't. You didn't say that earlier. That's happened quite a few times. Free speech is so important in representing who people are and what your beliefs are, but you do have to be very careful. For instance, the current university protests. There's a lot of people who have been flooding my inbox going, my First Amendment rights have been violated, this and that. But then I have to go on explaining how private universities versus public universities have a very wide difference in First Amendment rights. Are there First Amendment issues going on? Absolutely. I will absolutely not stand here and go, oh, there's nothing wrong. But you have to explain to people that you need to understand the boundaries of your own rights. That way you can fully embody your rights and also not accidentally creep across that line. Same for reporters. We have to make sure that, one, we know our press rights. I almost got arrested last week simply because I knew my press rights and I was not backing down. I was like, no, sir, I'm staying right here. That happens. But you have to know your First Amendment rights so that you know how to utilize them correctly, but also not accidentally creep past it and then either kind of gut your own message because you step past into illegality. There are people waiting to see a reporter cross the line. There are people waiting to see a protester cross the line and go, see, that's why that message doesn't matter. And I think that's a folly we all fall into, is that because it's such a polarized issue, we look at people and we wait for them to make a misstep. And we're like, haha, that's why I don't need to care about it. And that is just simply not true. The First Amendment is so intricate, and that's part of my job, is trying to disseminate the information about how the First Amendment works, because it is complicated. There's 200 plus years of precedent. You have to be careful using this power. It's a two-edged sword for sure. And I hope that answered that. There's so much to cover.
Yeah, I love that question. When I was in my media law class, we always talked about, the First Amendment protects your right to say something. It doesn't necessarily protect you from whatever the repercussions and fallout are from what you said happens. So that's a great question.
Can I add something real fast? I just remembered this. I did have a conversation. I will not name the lawmaker as it has been published and gone over before, but I had back in Jackson, Tennessee, there was a lawmaker I spoke to about the drag bill, and he gave me very graphic quote about how he felt about members of the LGBTQ community and this and that. It was a very, very long run-on sentence, and it made very explicit the motivations behind the bill. And he knew this conversation was on the record. I also knew this lawmaker was one that if you spoke to him, he would kind of just keep talking, and I will let you hang yourself with your own quote. So I was like, and ran that quote. And I got a call from him later. He called my cell phone somehow, and he was like, well, you could maybe paraphrase that a little bit. I meant that a little nicer than that. And I have such a great relationship with your paper, just love your reporting. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. I'm still running it. I even left the ums in it. So don't worry. And he made the mistake of going, now, honey, that's not what I said. And I was like, well, now it's getting moved higher. So so it is very much a double-edged sword. Like, if you're going to speak to the media, you better back your statements up, because I am interviewing you, and I will put your quote in.
Looks like we have another question in the audience. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My question is related to Dr. Davis's previous comments about journalists wearing bulletproof vests. So in Utah in the past few years, we've seen far-right extremists, mostly the Proud Boys, intimidating protesters and journalists at the Uprising for Black Lives in 2020 and more recently at drag shows. And then nationally in the past few weeks, we've seen reporters get arrested and brutalized by police. This has been really scary to watch as an observer. Can you talk about your emotional reaction to it as a First Amendment reporter of that intimidation? And then how you deal with that as somebody who's on the front lines reporting on it.
Yeah, the Proud Boys actually have a pretty heavy presence in Tennessee. I recently ran into them and their color-coordinated shoelaces. They attended one of the protests going on at the state capitol, one of the many protests at the state capitol regarding gun safety following the Covenant school shooting. And they were actually there yelling at one of the Covenant moms who was there, and that's how I heard it, because from the distance I hear a man yelling about, thank God the children died, because that was God's plan, and word for word. And I was like, So I scurried over there, and there was a group of, there was only about 10 or 12 of them, but they were very anti-gun legislation, and they wanted the Covenant parents to know that. And that is one of the double-edged swords of the First Amendment. They have a right to be there. They have a right to say that. The protesters also have a right to yell back at them. The longer the Proud Boys were there, the more creative the chants got against them. Someone brought out a ukulele and just started playing louder than the Proud Boys, which was impressive from a ukulele. So it's very difficult sometimes seeing that, because as a reporter, you have to be unbiased, you have to be neutral. But my God, do you want to give people a hug sometimes, because that woman was sobbing. And it can be, especially in a topic like school shootings, that's very hard to handle. So you have to remember, above all, that the First Amendment, again, protects everyone. It protects the Proud Boys just as it protects me. And then you also have to cover that with empathy and cover that very carefully. Sometimes when I'm not sure how to cover something, I will simply, very detailed, paint exactly the scenes in front of me, no other inflection, because what else can I say? A Proud Boy is yelling at a Covenant mom about thank God the children died. Like, what else can I say? What can I add to that? And so press safety does get pretty scary. I thankfully I've not faced a lot of the same violence as a lot of my fellow reporters, but it's gotten very close. I think I have elbowed one local reporter in the head at least 10 times, so the back of his head probably has an Angele Latham dent, because it gets very crowded, and their crowd crushes are a thing. And you have to be very aware of your situation, and then you have to cover things with deep empathy, because again, everyone is there for deeply impassioned reasons. It's very hard to have those interviews. It's very, very draining to cover those events. It is exhausting. It is emotionally and physically, it's a huge toll. Is also something I recommend all journalists get therapy for. Please, we are first responders in that way. Please, please, please take care of yourself. But it's a topic, we've had discussions in the newsroom about when do we need to write our wills, you know, like it's something you have to keep track of. And we're a pretty young newsroom. So it's something you really have to be aware of, that this isn't an issue that goes away. It isn't an issue that gets better. There is a strong increase in extremist responses to peaceful protests at a lot of the demonstrations at the Tennessee Capitol and across Tennessee and across the U.S. And it is something we have to make sure we have exit plans. We make sure we have very visible outfits. My press badge has gotten increasingly larger every protest I cover. So it's very, very large words press. We have lots of badges. We have things on our car to denote that we're press. We make sure we are in contact with a certain number of reporters at all times. We have to know what the best exits are, and we have a list of lawyers on our press badges, so we have immediate numbers if we get arrested. It's stuff you have to make plans for, and it's sad that making sure that the people are heard comes at a cost of we might not live. Don't know. I'm very blessed that I have not faced that level of danger yet, but I mean, we get a lot of threats. You get a lot of them. And that's unfortunately a reality with it. So again, free speech, it's amazing and it's good, and I'm glad it's here. And it's also something that can be very dangerous and very scary. And that's the difficulty of covering that.
Yeah, it seems like these conversations we've had to have as newsrooms a lot more. I remember being trampled at a protest in 2019 at the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. One of my photographers was pepper sprayed on January 6th at the Utah State Capitol. I think that there's a lot more conversations now happening about, you know, protest safety, newsroom safety that weren't happening. I think that speaks to how polarized, you know, some of these protests have really become. So I'm glad you guys are thinking about that. It looks like we have another question from the audience. Please go ahead.
Okay. So since you talk about more the First Amendment and more in Tennessee, I see that I'm wondering the impact of would be for Utah. And if you have something to say, so your last name kind of got on me because that is a company, airlines, that doesn't have the H though, but it is Latham. And if you, and with the impact of the COVID and now the borders closed, and I think what we're facing now is like a consequence of the events that comes from that time. It's just now like, oh, the Civil War is coming, or those other turmoils are happening, or try to defend LGBTQ, or that what it was. So relating to like facing all those aspects, like social and traveling connected, how Utah has to do with these ideas of, the truth amidst, and since we are more kind of a people of, faith, and we avoiding those kind of impacts. So maybe you can tell me that.
Yeah. I know a limited amount of that. This is actually my first time in Utah, apart from once being in the airport here. So I'm deeply enjoying my first time being here. But you are right, there's a deep level of faith in the state. I've had Jeremy as my tour guide. I've lost him now. There, he's moved. Excellent tour guide. I learned about every single labor union in your state ever on a fabulous walking tour with him. But it is deeply fascinating, the overlap of church and state and the impact of faith in this state. I'm obviously very new at learning about your state. I don't know much about it. But one light bulb moment I had when I was actually in the car with Jeremy yesterday discussing that was I was about to open my mouth and say, wow, it's so interesting the impact the church has on this state. And then I went, I'm from Tennessee. It's the same thing. Like, it's just a different flavor. I come from Baptist country. Like, I'm deep in the Bible Belt. I was raised a fundamental Baptist. Like, it's the same thing. So I think that's a very interesting, like, bridging point for a lot of people, is that faith is a very big issue in this country. The overlap of church and state is a huge part of my First Amendment coverage. I balance it a lot because we have a very strong religion reporter in the Tennessean, so I balance a lot of stuff with him. But we have a very strong level of coverage about the overlap of church and state. It is fascinating how that impacts a lot of decisions in this country. And it's really interesting how that shapes a lot of First Amendment. A lot of, literally every First Amendment coverage issue I've had has involved a religious aspect to it, because every single person has a level of faith in some way, and it impacts how they see the First Amendment. And it's so interesting, and you have to be very careful covering it, because again, it's a very personal topic. Faith is very near and dear to the heart. You have to be careful with that. But it's also so deeply interwound with our politics and just our country as a whole. And so you have to cover that with a lot of deftness and a lot of respect to the religion, because again, it's very akin to people's personalities. It's not like, oh, I'm this, oh, by the way, I also practice this. Like, if people hold it very near and dear. And so I never want to alienate someone on their speech simply because I don't understand their religion. And so with Utah, it's something, obviously, I know very little about, and I will not speak to something I don't know much about, but it is very similar to other issues across the country where you have to be very careful in your coverage, but also very aware of how deeply interwound it is in the politics and the expression of speech. So,
Well, Angel, I think we could sit here all day and talk about the First Amendment, but I think this may be all that we have time for. Can we do one more question? All right, we'll have one more.
If I can have the last question. What you were talking about, Angel, of all of these laws and policies changing as a reaction to what was going on in the community. Can you just provide us with a couple of tools and resources and best practices of how everyday citizens can hold our elected officials accountable to not be reactive when it comes to these kind of situations, but maybe be more proactive in terms of that healthy community debate?
yeah, absolutely. So the first and most important, I will say, and it's one you're going to be like, oh, I've heard this 1,000 times. Please vote. My God, please vote. I can't say that enough. The two things I think I say most in a year is please vote and legal precedent matters. People so often look at me, and I understand, and they're just helpless. They're like, how did we get here? We get here because people are not voting. And now there's a whole conversation we could have on gerrymandering. That is a whole issue, and voter suppression, and that is a huge issue. We could talk about that for hours. But my God, please vote. The reason we have such extremist push and pull of polarization is because only people with extreme views go out and vote. We don't have neutral to middle ground people represented in politics because those people are not voting. Please, for the love of God, vote. And then past voting, I think it's very important. One, like Dr. Davis said, please watch your local news. National news is great. Please support your local news. I think journalists sometimes, I don't know if this is a fault of our own or just journalism being an old institution and we're trying to adjust to the online world and everything. I feel like a lot of people don't know what journalists do on the day-to-day, or maybe go, oh, they're a journalist, but like don't know that it's like the person sitting beside you in a diner and they've been up since 2 a.m. writing a story that their editor's been waiting on for a long time. Like, we're just normal people in your community who deeply love the community they're in and want to serve it the best we can. Please pay attention to your local news. Please know the issues going before your city council, going before just your neighborhood groups. Know what's going on, because a lot of these issues start small. A lot of these legislators, a lot of these big laws, a lot of these things, you go, oh my God, how did we get here? It started somewhere tiny, and no one paid attention to it, and it was like a weed that just kept getting bigger, and now it's here, and now we're like, oh, where did it come from? You've got to know what's going on at the local level. Please vote. Please pay attention. You don't even have to be super involved. You don't need to go and give speeches to your city council. Please do. They make great quotes. But if you don't, please know what's happening, because when you get to the ballot box, and you go, I have no idea who these people are, I guarantee you that your local reporters have run about 8 million profiles on them, and they're like, oh, I hope someone read these. Please read them. Please, we work really hard on those. Know who you're voting for. Know what's happening. And then, I don't know, sometimes you can call your representatives. They should be answering their phones. My God, they get enough phone calls from me. Please call them and simply tell them. A lot of representatives go about their day-to-day basis not knowing how their constituents feel because no one's talking to them. And so then they're just making votes based on how they feel that day and if they had good chicken for lunch. Like, call your representatives, make your voices heard. You don't have to do much. You don't need to go protesting. You can, but you don't have to do the big things. Everything starts small, And that's how we protect the First Amendment, is you start small, do what you can in your every day-to-day life, and things will get better from there.
What a great place to end. Angele Latham, thank you so much.